In the last episode, I started putting things right on my long neglected daily driver's twin cam engine. I cleaned up all the oil that had built up over the last year or 4. I started replacing old worn out seals and damaged parts. But once I took a look at the valve clearances and the camshaft timing, I discovered that pretty much everything was out of time and out of spec. So in this episode, I'm going to set some accurate top dead center marks, set the valve clearances, and set the camshaft timing accurately. All of that will make a huge difference in how this engine runs and how tunable it will be in the future. So here's Porco's 1750cc engine. It's come a long way over the last few weeks, but today I have a few fiddly jobs to get done. In the last episode, I took measurements for the valve clearances on all 8 valves, and only 2 of them were near to spec, and a couple of them had less than half the clearance that they should have. So I need to set that up as best I can. But before I do that, I want to make sure my TDC pointer is in the correct place. With the engine at TDC, the cam timing is a little behind. This engine has a non-adjustable TDC pointer, and the pulley has only one position that I can fit to the crankshaft. So usually, if this pointer is all squared up, it will be in the right position. So I'm straightening it out, and then I'll check to see if it's correct. First up, the camshafts have to be removed. I will need these out in order to set the valve clearances later, but also it's best to have them out for my method of setting TDC marks. With the cams out and the top timing chain removed, I can turn the engine over any way I like without risking bending a valve, as they'll all be shut. Now this is my tool for checking and setting TDC markings. It's just a spark plug which has been hollowed out with an adjustable threaded stud running through it to act as a piston stopper. When it's threaded into a spark plug hole, it will stop the travel of the piston just before top dead center. I can turn the engine over and take a measurement of how far the pointer is from the TDC marking on the crank pulley, which is marked P. In this case, it's 6.6 millimeters. Then I can turn the engine backwards and see how far the pointer is from the TDC mark on the other side. If your pointer and timing marks are accurate, the measurement will be equal in both directions, because exact TDC is exactly halfway between those two stopped positions. And in this case, it's 6.6 millimeters again on the other side, so I'm happy that this pointer is in the correct position. If your measurements aren't even, all you have to do is bend the pointer or change the marks until it is even. And you can just add your measurements together and divide by 2 to know how much change you need. Very easy. I like this measurement because it takes into account the dwell of the piston at TDC, which isn't easy to measure even with a dial gauge. Feel free to fight about this in the comments section. Now that I have that out of the way, I can move on to the big job, setting the valve clearances. First up, I'm going to have to turn the engine over 90 degrees, so each piston is halfway up the cylinder, far from any interference with the valves, as I'm going to be turning the cams over by hand and opening the valves fully, so it's best the pistons are all as far away from the valves as possible. Under the cam followers, or buckets, are these little shims. They're pretty small. Here's one next to a 1 helicoin for scale. Changing these shims out for thicker or thinner replacements is what allows you to get the correct camshaft to valve clearance, which is important for a smooth and tunable engine. Thinner shims make for more clearance, and thicker shims make for less. The correct spec for these engines is 19 thousandths of an inch on the intake and 21 thousandths of an inch on the exhaust, with about a 1 thou allowance either way. That's around 0.48 millimeters and 0.53 millimeters, but I prefer to do this with imperial measurements. It's just a little bit neater. Here are my measurements for the existing clearances. They're pretty much all out of spec, apart from cylinder 4 for some unknown reason. Usually these measurements don't change once an engine is assembled. You could have valve seat regression or burnt valves, but that would usually mean the exhaust side measurements would be out and the intake would be unaffected. I don't think these were set correctly when this engine was last rebuilt, as there's no pattern to them. These clearances are all tighter than required, so I need to find thinner shims to add clearance. I need to remove and measure all my existing shims using a micrometer. Once I know how thick the current shims are, I can work out what size shim each valve needs as a replacement. The formula is this: existing shim plus required added or reduced valve clearance equals new shim. For example, the intake valve on cylinder 1 had a clearance of 11.5 thou or 0.292 millimeters. It requires an extra 7.5 thou or 0.19 millimeters of clearance to give a final clearance of 19 thou. The existing shim was 43.5 thou or 1.1 millimeters. Now, because I want more clearance, I need a thinner shim. A shim that is 36 thou, or 0.914 millimeters. Now, the issue is that the available shims range from 1 millimeter through to 2.5 millimeters. There's no factory shim that is this thin. This car clearly has pocketed valves or something like that, so I'm going to have to make a custom thin shim. Purists, look away now. I don't endorse doing this, but I need an extra thin shim, and this janky setup actually does produce a flat surface, weirdly. It's good enough. And luckily I only needed one of these non-standard shims. If this were a proper engine rebuild, and not a quick rescue, I would rebuild the cylinder head with new valve seats and get everything back into the realm of standard parts. But that's not what I'm doing here. I've repeated the process on all the remaining shims, thankfully without grinding any to be extra thin. Once I have the new set of shims, I can place them on their valves and reinstall the followers and the cams. If I did my measuring and arithmetic correctly, I should now have good clearance on all 8 valves. Turning the cams over by hand, I can check each valve for clearance. I should warn you here that you can't turn the cams over like this on a 2000cc engine, or an engine with big valves or high lift cams. You will need to do one cam at a time, as you can end up with the valves touching at the full open position. 1300s, 1600s, and 1750s in standard form won't touch. All but one valve are exactly where I need them to be. I think I had made a mistake on the initial measurement for the number 4 intake valve. After repeating the process for that valve, it's in perfect spec. Now that I'm happy with my valve clearance, I need to reinstall the camshafts for the final time and set the camshaft timing. I need to take the cams out again and turn the engine over to TDC. TDC without the cams in is when the distributor is pointing forwards. .105s have adjustable gears on the cams, and when setting the timing up after the cams have been removed, I like to keep the gears loose, with the main nut loose and the bolt removed. Before the cams go back in, I need to reinstall the upper timing chain, which is actually quite difficult. I recommend running a wire in when you remove the chain, as it's tricky to get the chain over the timing gear with the cylinder head in place. Now I can install the cams at or near their TDC position. Once they're bolted down, I can attach the timing chain and release the tensioner. Now the gears on the cams are still loose, but that means I can turn the cams until the TDC markings line up, and then fit the locating bolt into the gear. As you turn the cam within the gear, these holes line up, and once your cam is in the correct position, you can fit the bolt into the hole that lines up. Once that bolt is in place, the cams are locked into the timing chain, and I can now turn the engine over to test my timing. I found that after a rotation, my timing was a little slow, so I returned the engine to TDC, removed the bolts, and set my cams just a hair advanced of TDC. And when I turned the engine over this time, they ended up being in exactly the right place. With all that set, I can lock the chain tensioner bolt and tighten the nuts on the cam gears, as well as install some split pins on those locating bolts. And after a final torque of the camshaft bearing nuts, this job is done. I'm happy that the valve train is now in spec, or at least as in spec as it's going to be without a complete rebuild. Well, the engine is now that much closer to being reinstalled. All this work will make a big difference to how the engine runs, although I'm not optimistic that this will suddenly become a great engine. I think it will still burn oil and be a bit rough. But there's not much I can do about that apart from a full rebuild, which is not going to happen with this engine. Next up, I have to fit a new clutch, carry out some repairs on the old DCOE4 carburetors, fix some more leaks, and get the engine ready for installation. But that's all a topic for another video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.